I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Hi, friends. Welcome back. I had a wonderful conversation with Levin, the author of Civil War Memory, about history and memory, what we remember, what we forget, and who gets to decide. As you'll hear, this conversation reflects my own doctoral research, which is yet another reason our chat was so meaningful to me. I'm not going to recap the news. You get enough of that already. I want to thank you for listening or reading, and thank you for your support. I'm a team of one, so please subscribe, either paid or free, or give a one-time donation via Venmo. The place to do any of this is www.freedomoverfascism.us. While I'm here, I'm going to do a shameless plug for my business, B Cognition Labs, which provides empathy-based leadership courses to higher ed professionals. We call it Leadership by Humaning. If you work in higher ed in any capacity, the coming period is going to be rocky, and we can help provide you with skills and confidence to help you and those around you make good decisions. www.bcognitionlabs.com. DM me for more information. Now, here's my conversation with Levin, author of the Substack Civil War Memory, about remembering, forgetting, obscuring, or inventing history. Levin, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Levin is the writer of the Substack Civil War Memory and the author of the book Searching for Black Confederates. And so his focus primarily is on the Civil War, but I want to have a broader conversation about history and memory and why it's important, the way we remember and memorialize history. So recently, as in the Trump administration, they've started in the Park Service taking down information about the Underground Railroad. They defunded the historical museums in Washington and across the country, and they're telling universities what they can and can't teach, including the Naval Academy, where they've banned a bunch of books that are, Maya Angelou and about white supremacy or the Holocaust. So my question for you to start off is, what do you see as the most crucial piece for people to keep in mind as this is happening?
I guess where I would start is recognizing that many of the targets of the Trump administration over the past few months have been places that Americans hold dear. So places like Smithsonian, right? I mean, the Smithsonian museums in Washington, D.C. and across the country attract hundreds of thousands of people from across the country and even beyond the country. The National Park Service, some of our most important, iconic historic sites that also attract large numbers of visitors, have been targeted. So I think what I would really emphasize to get this conversation started is that this is history that belongs to all of us, right? These are places that have been entrusted to interpret and preserve history that belongs to all of us and that offers so many opportunities to make meaning, right? These are places that can enrich our lives. These are places where we can begin to think of ourselves as part of a larger narrative, as part of a larger community. And so whenever that is threatened, especially within a political context, as we've seen, we should be really worried, because once you're using history and public history specifically simply to further your own political ends, then you cease doing history. Then the project is something very different from, I think, what most Americans assume is the purpose behind the National Park Service and Smithsonian, just to use two examples.
And to be clear, that project that you're referring to,
Yeah.
the project that the Trump administration is undertaking by taking down websites about the Underground Railroad and removing Harriet Tubman from the narrative, they put some of it back, but is white supremacy. Can you talk a little bit more about what you think they're trying to achieve by creating a narrative without slavery without
Yeah.
African Americans.
First, I want to say, I think it's not so easy to really pinpoint the end goal for all of this. In some ways, what we're seeing is a continuation of what we've seen in the past. In other words, there's public history sites have always been politicized, right? Because of course, government is involved in it, government funding, support in various ways. Right off the bat, we're talking about politics here. But you brought up Harriet Tubman, which is so interesting because, I mean, we know that the Underground Railroad site, the National Park Service site, was edited. At the same time, a couple of years ago, at the end of Trump's first term as president, he came up with a sort of a project called, it was a Garden of American Heroes, is I think what he called it. And it's a list of basically statues that he would want to populate this garden with. And I guess Americans would visit and reflect on the greatness of the country. And if you look at that list, Harriet Tubman is there. There are a number of other African Americans on that list as well. Frederick Douglass is another example. I think what the Trump administration is really focusing on, however, is what it perceives to be a kind of radical bent to the National Park Service against Smithsonian and other institutions, which of course is just, flat out an inaccurate assessment of both of those institutions and pretty much the others as well. I'm thinking of a place like Arlington National Cemetery. I think what they see here, we've worked ourselves up into such a frenzy over the last few years because of the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the first Black president of the United States, that, we've lost our way. And people who have always been suspicious of a narrative of American history that sort of moves away from a white-centered view, a narrative of great white men, a narrative that sort of heralds and celebrates American freedom within this sort of narrow kind of American exceptionalist view, that it's kind of snowballed into what we're seeing. And so there doesn't seem to be much coherent thought around this. The whole sort of DEI idea has never really been clearly defined in my mind. What falls under that rubric, who is actually doing the work of scrubbing these websites, is also not clear. And so while I think, it's difficult to pinpoint a specific goal, it certainly follows the larger trajectory that we've seen over the past few years in terms of suspicion about how American history is interpreted at public sites and in the classroom.
Well, I think that from my perspective, DEI means whatever they want it to mean, as did CRT, as did
That,
so anything having to do with multiculturalism
that's right.
as
That's
a
right.
whole is, I mean, and one of their projects is removing meaning from language. So
And
that's a whole
controlling it.
bunch of stuff and controlling it, right?
Controlling it. Yeah.
That's a really good question, is who is removing the information from these sites? I mean, we know that, last week they defunded the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences,
Hmm?
but we don't know who's got the websites. And so when you have this one narrative of great white men, you you have a different end story about where we are and what our purpose is than when you include all of, how America was built. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
I think history becomes a tool of control, right? It becomes a way of controlling how people remember their collective past, which in turn, I think, assists in how we perceive the present. And so I think it makes it easier to carry out a certain political agenda. So if you're looking to dismantle landmark legislation, for example, from the civil rights era, controlling how people understand what occurred during the civil rights era, minimizing certain points of view, minimizing the work of certain individuals and organizations, demonizing them, whether it's a group like CORE SCLC, any of these sort of important organizations that were doing that work, it becomes more important, or I should say easier, again, to control the present. Another example that I love to bring up, because obviously I'm someone who's focused on the Civil War era and memory of the Civil War, is if you think about by the turn of the 20th century, the extent to which, for example, Confederate monuments define the commemorative landscape throughout much of the southern states, the former Confederate states, those monuments and memorials celebrated a very narrow, self-serving history. It celebrated, men largely and women who supported the Confederacy, who were, engaged in propping up that government in a 4-year war. It's important to recognize who was not, what memories of that war were not memorialized by the turn of the 20th century. African Americans who served in the United States Army helped to end slavery and defeat the Confederacy. But it's also the ways in which some of those monuments did depict African Americans. And so, for example, the Arlington National Cemetery monument that was removed in December of 2023, that was dedicated in 1914. And if you look at it, you can find images of it online. You will see among the many images on it, an African American woman being handed a child by a Confederate officer who's about to go off to war. So you have embodied in this monument
Mhm.
the image of the loyal slave, the loyal mammy, if you will. And so you ask yourself, what purpose does that serve? Whose memory does that work for? Does that support? And it supports this idea that white Southerners were benevolent slave owners, but it also supports the idea that African Americans still do not have to be treated in 1914 as full citizens. It's still a justification for second class status because they were always loyal to their masters, and even after the war, they remain loyal to the racial status quo. And so these messages are incredibly powerful. And I think that sort of drives home why we always need to be on guard when it looks like our government, our elected officials are using this memory for their own selfish purposes.
Well, one of the things that I'm going to talk about, and maybe you'll come back, is to talk about the importance of film in the 20th century, particularly Birth of a Nation,
Yeah.
um,
Gone with the
Gone with the
Wind.
Wind, in perpetuating that narrative. When the big conversation about some of these monuments was happening, I took a look at what monuments could have been there, right? All around the Caribbean, there are monuments to African Americans or Black slaves casting off their irons and really celebrating the idea that they have become independent, whereas you don't see that in the United States. So that's a certain the white
I
narrative.
would say, you're beginning to. I would say over the last roughly 2 decades, even in places like Richmond, you're beginning to see, I don't want to call it a counter narrative, because that narrative has always been there, especially within the African American
Right.
community. But it has everything to do, I think you would agree with this, with the ways in which local state governments are changing. They're now finally, in the post civil rights era, finally coming to more accurately reflect the communities, right? Their respective communities. And once you make that move, you're obviously able to, I mean, people within the community, organizations are able to pull those levers that were never accessible and make some of these, these new artifacts possible to begin to change, your local commemorative landscape. And so you're beginning to see, for example, statues and monuments celebrating the United States color troops. Many of them sit close to the older Confederate monuments, and that's a more complicated discussion. But you're also seeing examples of monuments and memorials commemorating the slave trade in places like Richmond and Charleston, new museums. I tend to also see museums as not so much a traditional monument, but certainly playing that role of pointing to how memory is changing, right? In some of these
Mhm.
places. And a place like Charleston, I mean, that's the seat of the rebellion itself, right? So there are some welcome changes, but certainly, and I think this is to your point, we have a long way to go.
We do. Although, in certain places, I remember the first time we're both sitting near Boston. The first time I walked the Freedom Trail, one of the first monuments you find is for the Black troops.
Yeah, the
So
54th.
that's I haven't told you this, so there's no way you should know it, but my academic work, my dissertation was about the history of a particular history museum, and how history museums in general reflect the values of the people who make them and the political interests of the people who make them, who might not be authoritarians. Maybe they're just like a product of their times. But how every decision
Hmm.
in creating a museum is usually thought through, and sometimes it's because of an ideology that they put something there, and sometimes it's because of really prosaic, "This is more
Yeah.
expensive than that," or "The funder will only accept that," or
Hmm.
but so this subject is really close to my heart because I feel like the way we remember history, whatever that memory is, says a lot about us as a present society, and really the memories narrative that gets passed along, the lost narratives get lost. Sometimes they are preserved in different communities, but when
Hmm.
they're lost, that changes the narrative entirely. And so, really, the powers who control the dominant narrative control our understanding of our past, which not controls, which influences our visions of the
Yeah,
future.
yeah. It's so interesting to hear this. I hope I'm following your point. I think I am. It reminds me of why I got so upset when I read the news about it came out in one of Trump's executive orders about the Smithsonian, as we were talking about earlier, but specifically the claims being made about the African American Museum, which of course is the newest Smithsonian museum, I believe, dedicated in, I think, 2016. And I don't want to minimize again the political divide between Republicans and Democrats that have in the past, fueled pretty serious debate about, what kind of interpretation these museums should be, sharing with the general public. But at least in this case, you had a Republican in George W. Bush who signed the legislation. You had a bipartisan group of senators who voted for it. George Bush gave one of the dedication addresses at the opening of the museum in 2016. Again, I don't want to minimize the politics of all of this, but that museum, it seems to me, had become, think about the history leading up to this, the challenges that you're getting at in even imagining a museum about African American history just blocks from the White House. And yet, it seems to me, and I've gone through it, I don't know how many times, alone, with students, with other groups, and it has become part of what you might call the mainstream view, right? I mean, we have seen a noticeable shift in how we think about American history at landmark museums like Smithsonian and National Park Service sites. I mean, I can't tell you, when I first started reading and studying Civil War history in the late 1990s, and especially an interest in public history matters, the big debate within the National Park Service was, should National Park Service guides talk about, while they're on the battlefield, the importance of slavery as a cause of the war, and even such issues as the home front? I mean, imagine you're standing on the Gettysburg battlefield in Pennsylvania. I mean, you can see the barns in which people lived before the battle took place. African American families, white families, and we're debating whether or not to talk about anything beyond the narrow scope of the soldier experience, and a narrative that harkens back to the early 20th century, which was essentially, we're going to talk about the bravery of Union and Confederate soldiers on the battlefield. These are common American values. These are shared American values. But we're not going to muddy the waters and talk about the respective causes for which they fought for. I
Right.
mean, that narrative has been so deeply embedded throughout much of the 20th century and even into the 1990s. And now looking back on that debate, I mean, it just seems it's laughable that we were even talking about that, because if you go to Gettysburg today, you will see a film featuring Morgan Freeman narrating the history of slavery, a museum exhibit which is centered around slavery and race, wayside markers on the battlefield that delve into these issues, and a National Park Service staff that is more than happy to create programs around these issues. What I'm getting at here ultimately is that one way to understand what we're seeing from the Trump administration is, in a way, a declaration of defeat. I'm not suggesting that damage can't still be done. It has been done. In some cases, it's going to take a significant time to repair it. But I think the reaction and the way in which they've gone about all of this, I mean, suggests to me that, you know, they are, in a sense, highlighting just how things have changed and will continue to change. So I ultimately remain optimistic.
As you said that, I started to put together a different picture in my mind. So the Trump administration seems to be trying to negate all of the history, um, the post World War II world order, and starting in, the 1890s and 1920s with a kind of an upside down picture of
Mm,
American
yeah.
history. So, in some senses, they're trying to get the country like off of the New Deal track. They're
Yeah.
trying to remove all of the 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 programs of the New Deal. They're trying to take away the post-war international consensus. So, as they hearken back to that time that they want to erase from, like, whatever, 1920s
Yeah.
on, that's the point at which the that lost cause narrative really gets strengthened and embedded.
Mhm.
So, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know that anybody's actually thought about it with this degree of intentionalism, but
Yeah.
it kinda makes sense if you think about the resegregation that they're trying to achieve and the erasure of what America became after
Yeah.
the Great Depression, or even to recreate
Yeah.
the Great Depression.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting, and I don't want to assume too much intentionality behind this, because I do see a lot of chaos, as we've both talked
Right,
about,
right.
regarding how the Trump administration has gone about all of this. But it is interesting that the way in which history has been leveraged by the Trump administration, they've done it in a way in which it's very difficult to distinguish between the actual discipline of history and other areas of academic thought. So, critical race theory, gender studies, the whole, the whole landscape, the whole academic landscape. And so, it comes out pretty clearly in the recent news out of the Naval Academy. And so they purged,
Mhm.
as you probably know, they purged somewhere close to 400 titles from the library. And what I found fascinating, I wrote about this on my newsletter, is that a number of the titles are as straightforward history titles as possible. I mean, they are mainstream studies of African Americans who fought in World War II. That's just one example. And so I think, if I had to assume, take a crack at, what's going on here, it's, let's just turn history as a discipline, make it indistinguishable from critical race theory. And so if you're talking about African Americans in the past, in American history, you're doing critical race theory. And because that has already become such a divisive concept, right? It makes it easy just to dismiss any reference at all. And then I think you're back to what we talked about a few minutes earlier, which is, once you do that, then you have a great deal of influence over how history is presented, taught in the classroom across the board. And that's a real That's a real problem. That is something that really worries me.
But it wasn't I kind of pulled a selection of what they purged. So there's Maya Angelou's,
Yeah.
okay? But then there's memorializing the Holocaust, gender
Right.
genocide, and collective memory.
Yeah.
So it seems that either they used AI to pick out things about gender and race
Yeah.
and religion,
Yeah.
or they're really trying to cut a really wide swath
Yeah.
through what they're planning on doing.
Yeah. Or they're just putting enough fear into the librarians on the grounds, and they're the ones who are culling through the stacks and just pulling anything where the title seems problematic. In other words, pulling anything that preserves their jobs. And I get
Right.
that. I mean, hey,
Although, also shameless plug for a moment,
yeah,
my husband, I and a third partner teach higher ed professionals a leadership course. And some of our biggest groups are librarians. Some of our schools are getting incredible pressure from the government, not just about the books that they take away. And we all know that a lot of present knowledge is less about books and more about electronic,
yeah.
but also say one of our students was from Sarah Lawrence,
Hmm.
and they are being pressured to give up names of students who have participated
Wow.
in various activities. So that's what they're facing every day. And I can't imagine the Naval Academy is any
Yeah,
different. And I think that just universities are as a whole, I don't even want to, I have a junior in high school. I don't even know what universities are going to look like by the time, he gets to college in a year and a half. But
yeah.
I think they're under incredible pressure to be an instrument of the state.
Well, I don't live in the academic world. I mean, more the public history side, but I've talked about this a couple times on my newsletter, and that is, every summer I work with teachers from around the country through various professional development workshops. One of them's in DC, and we take them over to Arlington National Cemetery, and we used to always have the staff at Arlington. They have a wonderful staff of historians and folks who are geared toward education. They want to work with teachers, they want to work with students. And I know for a fact that the whole controversy surrounding Arlington and the removal of web pages, specifically lesson plans that were carefully constructed, they were constructed with an eye toward meeting state curricular goals, the standards and everything. And I know for a fact these are people who they must be demoralized.
Right.
I mean, here they are trained to do these jobs and now essentially have to live in fear. They say the wrong thing on a tour, they post the wrong content on the website. And I think that's I mean, that's the damage that I guess both of us are worried about. It's one thing to be able to republish a web page. It's another thing to convince someone that they should consider a career in public history working for an agency of the federal government. And I think
Right.
we're in for a rude awakening. We're gonna suffer as a result of this, especially in the Park Service.
Well, I think what's really interesting about the Park Service is that the first time Trump was elected and this time, they're the first ones out there on social media with an alternative Park Service undermining the regime at every opportunity. And
Yeah,
I think it's amazing and
yeah,
hilarious,
yeah.
but also really, really important. As you said, I don't even think it's public institutions that need to worry. I think it's private. I haven't spent very much time in the South. I do know there was for a long time the question of, plantation tours and how much do you show the slave quarters and how much do you show about what life really could have was
Yeah,
like.
yeah.
And so, and I don't think those are necessarily all public. So I think
No,
it
that's right.
transcends public,
Yeah.
private.
I mean, it'll be interesting to see even places like Monticello, Jefferson's home in Charlottesville, Virginia, just sort of how they're being influenced, impacted by all of this. I mean, one book recommendation I can make if you're really interested in how these sites engage the public around questions of slavery, how they interpret slavery, is Clint Smith's recent book, How the Word is Passed. That's just a phenomenal book to get started.
I mean, there's the Monticellos and the Mount Vernons and the people in significant power, but South, the large
No,
plantation owners who, formed an oligarchy really.
I was thinking Deep South, but I was thinking Montgomery, Alabama. And I was thinking about your point about private institutions. I mean, one of the places to visit if you're down there, if you want to see a city that has been fundamentally transformed in terms of public memory, it's Montgomery, Alabama. And it's really the work of one person, right? It's Brian Stevenson, who obviously started the Equal Justice Initiative. And what he's done to the city is placed it on the map for places you can go to explore the toughest, most challenging questions, not just about slavery and race, but about the violence of slavery and white supremacy. And the lynching memorial, it's not just that it's in Montgomery. We're talking about the first capital of the Confederacy. We're talking about a site that actually looks out or looks even down at the Capitol building itself. The Capitol building still includes one massive Confederate monument dedicated in the 1890s, a statue of Jefferson Davis pretty much on the spot where he took the oath of office in 1861. But the city in so many ways, and it's a tough city to visit because there isn't much going on. Alabama is not a wealthy state, obviously. But still, I mean, it really does show what is possible if you have the resources and I guess the willpower to do it, right? And even the community support. I don't know much about how much buy-in there's been, overall in the Montgomery area in central Alabama, but it's a destination, and that's got to tell us something about where Americans are willing to go now, as opposed to just a few decades ago in terms of thinking about the past. And I find that promising. But
It's promising, but I think it's the dichotomy of some Americans are willing to go there
sure,
and do it through these sites and cinema and
yeah,
fiction and nonfiction,
yeah,
and how some of them want to continue the lost cause narrative or
sure,
the idea that slavery was not harmful and all of that. In fact, there was a conversation online yesterday or the day before on The Ink, which is another Substack, and Joy Reid was talking to Anand and talking about why, in particular, Black women aren't yet participating in a lot of the protests right now.
mm,
And
hmm,
they said, "Look, we voted 90% for Harris. You white people voted in the 50s. We're not gonna be like the pack mules for this movement right now. And we do not trust white people to not, tear down the Montgomery bus station
right,
to
also,
which is one of
yeah,
the memorials or the lynching memorial. So so there's this issue in people who believe in freedom, democracy,
yeah,
facts, about what some people might be willing to do and who has carried the burden of memory throughout the years.
yeah. I think that's a really interesting point, and it probably speaks to, at least in part, the ways in which African American women have been portrayed or not at all been portrayed in American history as full actors throughout the narrative. But I mean, I want to recognize that, but I also wonder whether there's enough wiggle room here to just focus on gender regardless of race, because Kamala Harris has something in common with Hillary Clinton, right?
Mhm.
And so I wonder if there are some parallels in terms of, how we can think about how women generally have been portrayed in American history or not been portrayed at all. at certain critical moments in our past.
Right.
Women's History Museum, which will eventually find a place on the National Mall. So these things are not unrelated.
No, and I'd be very interested, I mean, trying to take away whatever is in Trump's executive orders and whoever becomes in charge of creating these spaces, but I'd be very interested to see a women's museum, whether it becomes, a white women's museum or, incorporates a lot of, multicultural, not just Black, but
Yeah.
all the other
Yeah.
groups of women who are instrumental in getting us,
Yeah.
where we are today. You know,
I'm optimistic about that. I mean, some people think I'm just too optimistic across the board, but I don't know how to get up each morning without that. And again, I think it also, the fact that we're even talking about a women's museum strikes me as a reason to be optimistic. But I do think, look, the one thing we've learned over the past few months is vigilance has to be, we've got to remain vigilant. And I am encouraged by the fact that in a number of cases, we have seen pushback, right? I mean, and successful pushback. It's draining, it's exhausting, but there is a reason to be, I don't want to say the word optimistic again. There is a reason, or there is hope. We can embrace some hope here. That's all I'm trying to say.
well,
Stretching, reaching for some words here, like, all right, how do I say this? Yeah.
how do I say this? Yeah. I mean, all along throughout the history of this podcast, I've talked about hope as an action verb. You make hope
Yeah,
by
that's right.
doing the actions. And
Well said. Yeah.
people would ask me, "Why are you doing this?" And the answer is because I couldn't get out of it any other way. And still, there's a piece of me that's horribly cynical, and I almost have to force myself to keep having these conversations
Yeah.
because it's the action of having these
Yeah.
conversations that
Yeah.
provides the hope and the interest in continuing along.
There's a lot about this that seems to me to be generational. And I guess that is just the history teacher in me. I find young people, I've always found young people who enter my classroom as sort of a reason to be hopeful. And I think with each generation, we get closer, to some of these goals. Not all of them. It's a continual fight, but I think we get closer.
And I would submit that we probably get 2 steps closer and 1 step back, or 1 step closer and 3 steps back. But
I agree.
I absolutely take your point. I think just having these conversations, and I would love to have more of them with you, are ways that we can continue the fight in our heads and continue to think about the reason why we are pushing back
Yeah.
and
I would
what's
love
at
that.
stake. I I have totally enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah.
You are welcome back whenever. Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Please subscribe at www.freedomoverfascism.us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.